I'm not getting introduced. I've been told just to introduce myself, so I'm going to jump in. Hi, good evening. My name is Konrad. I'm the founder of Falcon Coffees. We're a green coffee trading company based here in the UK. We buy coffee from a lot of places and we sell it into a lot of places. Personally, I've been in coffee for 22 years. It's been a gift. It continues to be. It's taken me to more than 40 countries, many of them repeatedly over that time. The purpose as Falcon for a business is really twofold. The first is to keep myself, my colleagues and our families in a place of financial security, which is probably pretty much the purpose of all businesses, to give our investors a return. And the second is for social impact. That stands parallel to that secondary need. The reason for that is that myself and the people that I work with believe that coffee holds this incredible latent potential to be a driver for social change on a global level. And that if we as a coffee community could harness this potential, could focus it, could release it, is that impact could push beyond just our coffee communities and possibly into other agricultural industries in the world today. So the goal I've set myself this evening is to really walk you down the path towards the coffee garden of Eden and to get you to bite into that apple, to drink the Kool-Aid. So hopefully I succeed. I wanted to start really by sharing my failures and setbacks, not all of them, it's not enough time, just the ones that are pertinent to this talk this evening. I started my coffee career based in South Africa in the early 90s, and the place that we worked was Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had a small but thriving coffee industry in the Eastern Highlands on the Mozambican border. And I used to drive up there every 6 weeks and barbecue and drink beer and play with people's kids, and it was fantastic. And then in the late 90s, I think 98, Zimbabwe held a referendum. Robert Mugabe, the prime minister, wanted to be president for life. The referendum was no. He was shocked, and so began land confiscations of white-owned farms. And very quickly, this imploded the entire agricultural industry inside of Zimbabwe, and with it, the coffee industry. So we found ourselves without any work to do and kind of lost our income. I'd also started working in Zambia, just north of Zimbabwe, and Zambia also had a small but thriving coffee industry. And a couple of things happened over a fairly short period of time. The first was the global economic boom leading up to the collapse of 2008. And then we saw a huge demand for raw materials coming out of countries like China. Zambia is a copper producer. The copper price rose to the highest it had been since the end of the Vietnam War. The result of that was the Zambian kwacha valued against the dollar. And at the same time, Zambian government increased the minimum wage for laborers by 30%. So when you take Zambia is a landlocked African country. There's a huge distance between Zambia and any port. So when you look at the net cost of import and export, the production cost is extremely high. If you couple that with the fact that Zambia doesn't rely on rainfall, but it has sub-Saharan water, it has something like 20% of sub-Saharan Africa's subterranean water, rather, in aquifers, but it means you have to irrigate, which also pushes up your cost of production. With the collapse of Zimbabwe, which was a food basket for that region, Zambia picked up that mantle. And so the coffee industry in Zambia collapsed. A lot of those farmers moved to growing grain crops because of the demand. And it was also mechanized, so the labor cost went down significantly. The other part of this piece was I was invited by the USAID to work in Angola to look at a coffee rejuvenation program there. So Angola suffered a 27-year civil war, started in the early 70s. Pre the start of that civil war, Angola produced about 3 million bags, 180,000, 200,000 tons of what is touted to be the best Robusta coffee in the world. End of the war, what happened during the war, there'd been huge urbanization into the city. The USAID and other aid organizations were looking at getting those populations back into the rural areas to grow food and to all start growing cash crops, income crops like coffee. So that culminated in us starting a small export operation in Angola that died fairly quickly. The two reasons for that was that the war had destroyed the infrastructure so badly. The roads were so decimated that things like transport, if you could find it, were horrifically expensive. The other was that Angola is an oil economy. The oil industry, with the money that it had or has, just drove up internal prices to such a degree that Luanda, I think even today, the capital city of Angola, remains one of the most expensive cities in the world, if not the most expensive. I then went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You got to wonder.
You're creeping up towards London, are you?
Slowly moving my way there. And we started, most people, when they think about coffee in the Congo, they think of the Eastern Congo and the provinces of Kivu. But Robusta coffee is actually indigenous to the Congo and Uganda. So just above Angola on the western side, we operated in an area called Bakongo, where there's a very small, hard bean Robusta called Petit Kwilu. And we were probably the first foreign company to invest in that region since the Belgians had left sometime in the 60s. And we built a milling operation there. We bought land, we imported Brazilian coffee machinery, Mercedes-Benz trucks, motorbikes. We brought in capital and financed middlemen to go out into the forest where people would forage for coffee as they foraged for food. There's no cash in these economies. And we were exporting thousands of tons of coffee. What then happened was there was a conspiracy inside of the Congo to squeeze us. So we were drawn in, made the investment. Suddenly we had to have a weight certificate for every container. So the Port Authority didn't have a scale, but it was $750 for that piece of paper. Because we didn't have a weight certificate, we weren't sure what was getting loaded in the container, and our coffee was getting stolen out of the containers at the port and being resold back to us. Suddenly it was hard to get our dollars out of the bank. Anyway, this constricted us to the point that we walked out of the Congo. We locked our doors. I'm still a property owner in the Congo, and we were down $1 million when that happened. So we started Falcon at minus 1 million in 2008. So as you can imagine, there were some very dark moments along that way, personally, financially, and professionally, and I had to wonder about the coffee industry and my success in it. And then I picked up a book by chance by an economist called Paul Collier, called The Bottom Billion. It's an amazing book. I recommend you read it. The suggestion of this book, or the message in this book, is that there are the bottom billion people on Earth that are separated out from the other 5 or 6 billion, and that we have a collective responsibility to take care of these people and to improve their lot in life. Because basically, if you remove people's hope and dignity, is the moral fabric of society begins to decay. And what you land up with is these rogue states like Somalia, for instance. And what happens in a place like Somalia is radicalization, and then that's get exported globally, and I think we all know the results of that. But in this book, I'm calling him Mr. Collier, I mean, I can call him Paul. Mr. Collier, he listed 4 things, the 4 poverty traps that countries fall into. The first is bad governance, just poor leadership. The second is countries that are in conflict or recently post-conflict. The third is landlocked with poor neighbors. You're relying on countries to trade with around you that are very poor. And the fourth is, interesting enough, mineral wealth. Okay. So when I took those 4 poverty traps and I looked at those 4 examples that I gave you, I saw Zimbabwe, landlocked with poor neighbors, bad governance, and post-conflict, 3 out of 4. Angola, post-conflict, bad governance, mineral wealth. Went to the Congo, post-conflict, in conflict, virtually landlocked apart from the river, mineral wealth, and bad governance, all for the Congo. Zambia, minerals, landlocked with poor neighbors. So, I saw the rhythm inside of these places that I've worked that fallen into these poverty traps. And then what I did was, I kind of, imagine Google Earth, and I sort of drew back and had a look at the coffee world, at where coffee is produced. And the first thing that you need to know about coffee production is that, and more than half of the world's coffee is produced by an estimated 25 to 30 million smallholders across 45 to 50 countries in the world. And when you start looking at these countries, and I'm going to go through a few, and you think of those poverty traps, if we start in Latin America, you have Peru with a shining path, the defoliation against cocoa production. You have Bolivia. Bolivia's had nearly 200 coups since independence in 1825. That's like more than one a year. Colombia, FARC, civil conflict, civil war in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Mexico, narco trafficking. If you move to Africa, genocide in Rwanda, Idi Amin in Uganda, the Dirge in Ethiopia, ethnic cleansing in Kenya, Nyeri's social experiments in Tanzania. And you look at Asia, you've got Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, and you see all of these coffee-producing countries fall into these same poverty traps. I made this slide a couple of years ago, and I looked at the World Bank's list of nations by economic wealth, so GDP and purchasing parity. And if you take the poorest 30, the bottom 30, 21 of these countries are coffee-producing countries. The International Monetary Fund runs a floating list of the bottom 40 highly indebted poor countries, HIPCs. These are countries with high levels of debt, high levels of poverty, and low levels of development. Of these bottom 40, and we're talking about the Syrias and the Afghanistans and the Somalias, of these bottom 40, 25 are coffee-producing countries. So what that tells us, and Ben, it's not such a radical idea, what that tells us is that the base of the matrix that feeds our industry, the base of the matrix that we make our living from, is populated by people that are extremely vulnerable. They're vulnerable, they lack personal security, they lack food security, they lack access to credit, they lack access to education, to healthcare. Many of these people have a life expectancy of 50 years or less. They can lose 1 in 3 of their children by the age of 5 to malaria, to malnutrition, to HIV/AIDS. So this is people in incredibly vulnerable position. And as an industry, we're wanting to leverage social and environmental responsibility and change. But when you live in this degree of poverty, your timelines and your horizons and your priorities are very, very different. As coffee people, we travel to origin countries, and we kind of have our goggles on, our coffee goggles on, and we look at the coffee and we look at the poverty, and we sort of drop the coffee on top of the poverty, and we hold coffee responsible. But the illustration is really that these people are not poor because of coffee. These people are just poor people who happen to be farming coffee. If you look at the flip side of our industry, which is the cafes and the roasteries and the retail side of coffee, is we have explosive growth. We're incredibly healthy. We've shrugged off the recession of 2008. You have a trend line in coffee consumption that's pretty much tracked at 2% growth per year in terms of demand on coffee. This last year it dropped to, it's an interesting statistic, it dropped to about 1.5% due to a fall off in the United States, and that's been put down to the efficiency of single serve and the growth of single serve. If you look at, I read an ICO report, so I can use these figures. ICO put out a report that says that Asia today consumes 23% of the world's green coffee. Okay. By 2025, that is projected to be up to 50% of the world's green coffee. So you keep those numbers in mind, and you look at per capita consumption demographics. Lots of statistics, but I'm sure you'll be fine. If you take Finland is the highest at about 12 kilos per person per year. And then you take the biggest market, the United States, which is at 4.1 kilos per year. They're number 20th. You go to China and you go to India, per capita consumption in China is 10 grams per year per person. In India, it's 80 grams. Okay. There's a recent report from Starbucks. They're about to open their 1,600 store, or just have, in China, just in China. Their aim is to be at 10,000 Starbucks stores in China within the next 5 years. So what we have is an incredibly robust, healthy, thriving, liquid, prosperous coffee consuming community with huge potential for growth. So if you look at where coffee comes from, and you look at the producing countries, and you think about the other side, and you think about what we could achieve if we could take this $100 billion behemoth and growing and channel that back down the supply chain, the kind of change that we could drive. I mean, we could affect the lives of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. We could change entire economies. You know, I think one of the beautiful things about coffee is that so little happens to it. You know, from the bean, when you take it off the tree, you expose it to heat, you fragment it, you extract it, and you drink it. It's you know, visually you remain very connected. It's very easy for us to capture the imagination of consumers, and I think even part of our seduction, by coffee is that we can stay so connected to it as an organic product, as something that is of the earth. I think that is a very powerful thing. So what that also makes it easy for us to do is to then look at these problems inside of coffee producing origins and quickly realize that those problems are our problems. If we rely on the raw material to come from these countries and these kinds of people, that socioeconomic backdrop, their challenges are our challenges. And the result of that is a fantastic one. You know, in the last 15 years, you've seen this surge in sustainability. You know, that word has been beaten to death and continues to be beaten to death, but with good purpose. You know, you have an industry that I think is unique in its unity and its commitment in recognizing that something needs to be done if we're going to be able to get the raw material and the volumes we need in the next 25 years to feed our factories. What I call kind of sustainability 1.0 would be the rise of certifications. You know, and I think these certifications are important. They create standards. They create tools for measurement. But I think we need to be very careful they are not the silver bullet to sustainability. I think they're very much consumer facing. They allow brands to declare to consumers that they have responsible sourcing policies, but they are not the answer. And I'm pretty sure that all of these certifications would agree with me. They have a role to play, but they are not enough. The next, direct trade, which is, I think it's sort of code for death to the middleman, which would be me. Direct trade, I'm still not sure that it's been defined. I'm still not sure who owns it. I think the third wave roasting community probably do, but I really like the term. You know, what I like about direct trade is it's this desire by people, by coffee roasters, to connect with the people, the farmers and the communities that they get their coffee from. There's this decommoditization of coffee taking place, which is critical to sustainability. This is a very human story. It's not a coffee story. The third version of sustainability, which for me is the big daddy, is about the hard economics of coffee, both macro and micro. The micro would be around coffee production. What does it cost? What does it really cost to produce coffee? The macro would be the larger economic environment in these communities and in these countries. You know, what I like about this version is it's, rather than saying I have a solution, it's an acknowledgement to the size and the complexity of the problem and a recognition that we have to attack it from so many different angles. So really, if we recognize sort of my primary or initial message that poverty is in fact the greatest hurdle to achieving sustainability, and we talk about the economics, surely the first step has to be to ask ourselves, how do we increase the revenue back to farmers? How do we get more money into the pockets of farmers? So, slide not done. There we go. This diagram, and it was really cool because there's quite a few of my slides, Nadine, which are, you talk about efficiency and talking about risk, and I want to talk about all of those things. And this is a different version of a similar slide to the one Nadine had. So on the x-axis along the bottom is really each of the processes that takes place from the tree to the point of export. So I'm going to talk specifically about what happens inside the coffee origin, okay, from the tree to the point of export. That's the place where we live and work every day. So at the very beginning, you have coffee at its lowest possible value. That's picked as cherry from a tree. You then have that coffee pulped. It then gets fermented. If it's a washed coffee, it goes through a washing and a drying process. It then gets milled and graded in preparation. And then finally for export. Every one of these processes adds incremental value to the coffee inside its coffee of origin. But yet today, there are many, many, many coffee farmers who liquidate their crop at its lowest possible value, and that is as fruit off the tree. And the reason that they do this is quite simply they need the money. They need money for exactly the same reasons we need money for. They need money to pay school fees, to buy food, to pay for medicine. And without access to credit, they have no way of taking ownership of or participating in any of these processes. And if you look at a timeline, we built a timeline in Rwanda. From the time that cherry is picked until it's finally exported, you're talking about 2 months. That credit doesn't exist for those farmers. So this is a primary problem. So if we're going to create a system, or if we're going to try and increase the revenue back to smallholder farmers, the easiest way is to really look at creating a system where farmers can participate in the highest value of their crop. And that's crop at the point of export. We haven't got to yields and agronomy and access to credit, just simply allow them to participate in all of those revenue or value increasing processes. What we have today, same slide, why cheap so high? We didn't collaborate on this. What we have today is inside of Coffee Origins, we have a business model that sees large multinational companies and exporters investing in extensive infrastructure inside of these countries. And that infrastructure is really to take ownership of all of those processes post-harvest. And in doing so, they add value for themselves by taking ownership of the coffee. The reason that the system has shaped itself like this in the last 4, 5, or 6 decades is not because these people are villains. Go back to the profile of coffee-producing countries. These are risky environments. They are illiquid. Investors don't want to be there. There isn't cash in the system. So these are the people that bring the money into the system. Then when you look at the farmers, you realize smallholder farmers have no land tenure. They have no assets. They have nothing to leverage. They have no collateral. The collateral is the coffee. So for these companies that bring that kind of liquidity into these markets, the only collateral they can have is the coffee. The safest thing for them is to take ownership of that coffee as quickly as possible. And again, to Nadine's slide, every one of those processes can detract from the quality of the coffee. They can be mismanaged. So by owning the process, you also protect your quality investment. So unfortunately, we have a dominant internal supply chain system that is in conflict with this idea of farmers participating in this higher value. So really, we have an analog problem, and we need a digital response. I think I'm not a techie by any means, but someone explained to me in the United States that it developed, its telephone system so early, did so as an analog system. So it was prohibitively expensive to do the conversion to digital. You go to a country like Kenya, which I think is the fastest place to get a mobile phone today, even Uganda, it's because there was no analog system. So, sort of 3G stepped straight into that market, and there was a vacuum, and they're incredibly efficient. Coffee faces this problem that a lot of the power and a lot of the money and a lot of the investment and the skills and the business culture is established in taking this ownership. What I've done is I've tried to create a formula that really represents the opportunity, both the challenge and the opportunity inside of supply chains in terms of what the culture is, what some of the challenges are, and what we can do about that. There are 4 pieces or components to this formula. And the first is what I call the emotional premium. The emotional premium is the price that roasters are willing to pay for coffee. Okay, and that price will fluctuate based on quality and transparency and relationship and origin and availability. But that is what roasters are willing to pay. The second part is real cost inside the country of origin. What is the real cost of doing business? What does the finance cost? What is the transport cost? What do bags cost? What does insurance cost? All the real costs of doing business, which we're all familiar with. The third piece is the risk premium. And this is risk, real and perceived, that manifests inside of these countries and inside of these supply chains that erode a lot of the revenue and create uneven revenue distribution between that emotional premium and what the farmer finally gets, which is farmer income. So that's it. You're bookended between the roaster price and farmer income. What we have to work with is everything in the middle. When I talk about risk premiums, what are risk premiums? And this is very much the work that Falcon does, is we want to understand is what are the different processes that take place tree to point of export? Who are the players? What does it cost? What are the dangers and what are the risks? So an example would be, we do a lot of work in the Ruwenzori Mountains, which forms the border between Uganda and the Congo. It's a remote place. There's an estimated 1 million smallholder coffee farmers in those mountains. So it's a roadside economy. No one goes there, no one can get up there, excepting one guy who has the dialect, he has the truck, and he's got some money. And he's the one buyer of the bananas and the sorghum and the coffee and anything else that is being sold on that roadside. That coffee that then gets handed off and sold in a marketplace in the closest town, Kasese. And there you have the first real coffee men, middlemen that will get involved. What they do is they take this coffee, it's an Arabica coffee, and they blend up to 15% Robusta in, because of the price arbitrage. Robusta is a much cheaper coffee, and they're going to sell it as an Arabica, so they create premium that way. They buy rancid stock lots from neighboring countries like the Congo and Burundi and Rwanda, and they blend these coffees together. And this coffee goes out as Drugar. It sounds like something Darth Vader would drink. Drugar, dry Uganda Arabica, and it's the worst, cheapest, nastiest Arabica coffee in the world. Yet this coffee's grown up to 2,300 meters above sea level. It's the old SL28 in 14 varietals. Fantastic cupping profile. Volcanic soils. It rains every afternoon at 3 o'clock. You've got a microclimate from those mountains and from the lake. So you have this abusive system, and that is risk that sort of manifests inside these supply chains. Plus all then the transport costs and the fact that Uganda is 1,000 miles away from the closest port. So the idea of this equation is the idea of identifying and capturing what I call this lost revenue. So what you have, if I show it to you, it would help. What you have is the emotional premium, which is the money we have to work with. It's the price from the roaster. And if you subtract from that the real cost of doing business, and you subtract from that the risk premium, what you're left with is the farmer income. So what we try to do inside of these supply chains is to negate that risk, okay, in various ways, and capture all of that risk premium and move that over the equation to the side of the farmer. Because what we can then do is radically increase income to the farmer without asking the roaster to pay any more money. Great in theory, I can feel it. So the theory behind that, or what we look to do, what we do is to control all of these processes inside of the supply chain, to know who all the different people are that play a role. There's no one person, no one company that has the resources to manage and finance and the skill set it requires. Coffee is incredibly complex from tree to cup. There's no one company. It's about collaboration. So it's about pooling resources, knowing who to partner with, and then in that way is negating this risk and capturing this lost revenue. I think of it like a tube of toothpaste, if you like. You have the money from the roaster, and if you think of a child, pushing on a tube of toothpaste, it's incredibly inefficient. So all we're looking at doing is squeezing that toothpaste in a way that you get the maximum out. The amount of money doesn't need to change. We just need to get better at the way that we spread that money around. So this is really the idea of zero cost sustainability. It's that there is enough revenue in the system to drive enormous change and deploy that lost revenue into these supply chains. To do this, though, requires a huge shift in thinking. We have to rethink in what we do. We need to recognize that we have to collaborate, that everybody has a role to play. What we need to recognize is that everybody adds value to the supply chain, or everyone who does add value to the supply chain needs to cover their cost and make a profit that is proportional to the value that they bring. That is absolutely vital, because when you have a long supply chain that involves a lot of people, a lot of processes, and a lot of risk, is we are all vulnerable to the collapse of any part of that supply chain. So the collaborative piece is very important, and the ability to recognize the value and to reward accordingly. I want to talk about collaboration that pertains to Falcon, and I didn't come here to talk about Falcon specifically, but I feel like I've given you a lot of theory, and what I want to say to you is that this is not theory, it's not pie in the sky. This is what we do as a business. This is how we make a living, is building collaborative supply chains across various origins. So some of the work that we do, Falcon today is the largest buyer of traceable, ethically sourced Ethiopian coffees in the world. In the mountains of Uganda on the eastern side, we built community wet mills with Panagos eco-pulpers from Colombia. And over a 5-year period, those communities have paid us back in coffee, and they own those operations today. We partner with Ben Affleck's Eastern Congo Initiative and the Howard G. Buffett Foundation. We're building wet mills for communities in the Kivu. And in year one, we tripled the household income of 4,200 households in Kivu, which is one of the toughest places, definitely, that I've ever had to work. We have a sister company in Rwanda Trading Company, and built into the DNA of that organization is a farmer impact business model. We work with 6,000 households in Rwanda. In the last 12 months, we've increased household income by 68% in over a year when the coffee market lost 11% of its value. I'm incredibly proud of being able to work with the people and what they're delivering on the ground. In 2009, we put $416,000 down in a standby letter of credit. We stood guarantor for 47 farming communities in Ethiopia, more than 100,000 people. They couldn't get credit because they'd never borrowed. No bank had ever lent to a smallholder farmer. So the bank wanted us to stand as guarantor. So if any of those farmers defaulted within that 4-year period, they would take the money from us. We got every single dollar back, bar a small amount from a community that were decimated by drought. Otherwise, that money has all come back. That coffee today is being sold to third-wave roasters for some of the highest premium coffee out of Ethiopia. So this is what we do, and we know it's achievable. We see it on our bottom line. It's our biggest growth area, and it's solid revenue for us, and it has the lowest risk. I wonder how many people in the room recognize. Well, does anyone know the name of this thing? You even know, perhaps you don't even know. It's called a Klotsky puzzle. We used to get them in Lucky Packets when I was a kid. It's a very 2-dimensional Rubik's Cube. And I use that graphic because of my age. Because the idea is that sustainability, we have all the moving parts. We don't need to create any more parts. We just kind of got to line them up in the correct way to have the impact that we need to. And finally, my last slide was emailing with Tim, and we were talking about sustainability. So my favorite definition of sustainability. And what I love about this definition is it talks about stewardship and shared responsibility. That for me is this idea that we are all collectively responsible. We are all stewards for the natural resources in coffee and elsewhere in these supply chains. So how we treat these farmers, how we interact in these supply chains has a direct impact on how those resources are managed. So it is a shared responsibility. You know, in closing, what I'd like to say is that coffee has this enormous potential to drive social change on an unprecedented level. I think that as a community globally, that we are way ahead of the game. Perhaps we recognize the true threats to the future of our business as much more real and much closer than a lot of other industries. And I think that coffee has a role to play in creating the blueprint to sustainable agriculture across all smallholder agricultural industries in the world. And I just think it would be an incredible thing to be part of that legacy for all of us. So best we do it. Thank you very much.
That's a fantastic talk, Konrad. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think, Nadine, would you be willing to come up just to both presenters? If anyone has any questions, you can ask either or both, and maybe just say who your question is for. Is that great? Yeah, okay, so I'll just fire away, I guess.
All right.
Hello, Konrad. Thank you for the presentation. Very touching. My question was, you were talking that by allowing the farmer to, let's say, go from lowest point of value to the highest, you create more value for the farmer. Yeah. But for example, smallholders cannot actually buy a last technology wet mill like the one you described from Penagos, a Belkosop or something like that, that will save water at the end, and it will be environmental sustainability. So how do you deal with that?
I think for me is there are really only two parties who add value to coffee itself. That's the farmer that grows it and the roaster that roasts it. Everybody else in between is a facilitator of that relationship, is a service provider. So I'm not suggesting that farmers should, should build these systems for themselves. I mean, God knows there's more than enough infrastructure in origin. But I think this idea of buy low, sell high, and the coffee changing ownership through these processes needs to move to one of service provision. You know, as a milling company charges a fee for and roasting company for toll roasting. These operations, rather than taking ownership, should consider a service fee model.
Sorry, for let's say post-harvesting process.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
I just have a question. It was interesting to see the specific emphasis placed on the supply chain, because always in London we hear about consumer transparency, always letting the consumer know where it comes from. Obviously that's very difficult. So I was wondering, what do you think is more important in terms of the next step? The refinement of the supply chain, or improving the supply chain, or focusing on consumer transparency? Where does the coffee industry need to focus on now?
I think consumer transparency is about marketing. I think that what coffee offers is a vehicle for a lot of other industries to piggyback on. And an example that would be is we work with a lot of social impact investors, and these are high net worth individuals. They're non-profits, they're for-profits. Responsibility is a asset management fund out of Zurich, and we're a large client of theirs. They specifically lend money to companies that behave in a way that has positive social and environmental impact. What they struggle to do is deploy into these environments. You know, how does somebody from Zurich step into the Congo and lend money? Who do they lend it to? Well, we have the infrastructure, but we don't have the liquidity. because my banks out of New York don't want me to put money into the Congo. So again, that's collaborative. So the coffee contract is this vehicle. If I'm sure there are a number of roasters represented here, is when we can go to a bank and say, we have an off-taker of this coffee. Roaster X is a buyer at this price. That contract allows us to leverage finance and put that money back into those communities. Certainly a lot of coffee origins are awash in NGOs that are working with everything from healthcare to agronomy. So mobilizing coffee communities into coherent units where you can reach a broad number of people.
That's really interesting, actually. And would you say that's more sustainable than certifications? Because I often use my mum as an example. So my mum goes into a coffee shop and she's told there's fair trade, and she's told there's Rainforest Alliance and bird friendly. And are these just? Do you think these are just trends that come and they pass?
I don't know. Just a coffee guy. What I do. The problem with certification is the cost thereof. Smallholder farmers struggle to bear the cost. So if you have a country like Ethiopia where the coffee is by default organic, in fact, a lot of farmers in East Africa can't afford. 3 highest elements to producing coffee is labor, cost of finance, and agrochemicals. So with no credit, you have no finance costs, you have no access to agrochemicals, you can't buy them, and you are your own labor. So by default, most of these farmers are organic, but they will never be able to afford organic certification. And if you look at the map of certified coffees, when you go to origins like Peru and Honduras, you will find cooperatives carrying 3 or 4 certifications. Because when you do a gap analysis, they're all very similar in terms of their standards. It's international labor organizations, rules on minimum wage, child labor, all these things. So if they have one certification, it's easy to get the next one. You go to Africa, and a few years ago, maybe it's still true, Africa produces less than 1% of the world's certified coffees. So the certifiers are not operating with the most needy, not the silver bullet. Yeah. So.
Firstly, I thought that was great and a hell of a lot to take in a short presentation. But I just wanted to touch on where you were speaking a bit about collaboration, and actually even in Nadine's talk as well, and this idea that we need to involve everyone in the process. And with the exception of Robert Mugabe, government was left out almost completely. Are they, the governments in these areas, are these parties that you need to be working with as well? I mean, even looking at Nyeri a couple of years ago and instability created there, I guess government has probably more power than anyone to undo all the work of putting the supply chain together. And how do you manage that risk?
Yeah, I mean, as a company, we are we're fairly gun shy of getting lobbying government. It varies. You have some, certainly in Latin America, where a lot of countries are coffee economies, you have organizations, governmental organizations, which are very active. And then in a lot of the countries, other countries where we work, they are not. So, yeah, we're careful. Sometimes we just don't want to attract the attention, frankly, because you're talking about vast sums of money. Last year, 2014, we spent $52 million in cash, in coffee-growing countries buying coffee. That can also attract completely the wrong kind of attention. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talks. I just wanted to follow up on your question, because if you look at the value chains...
Press the button.
Oh, sorry.
Better? Oh, yeah. Just following up on the questions on value chain or capturing more value, wouldn't be then the next steps to go into the roasting business, roast your own coffee, then the next step, retailing it?
No. No. I don't. What I know about roasting coffee, you can cover the back of a matchbox. You know, but coffee growing is a full-time job. Coffee roasting is a full-time job, and what I do is a full-time job. You know, I don't ever give growers advice on how to grow coffee or roasters on how to roast. Although both would like to give me advice on what I do. But I think what I do know about roasting coffee is that there was a great article on the. It's a long answer to a short question, but here we go. There's a great article on the Australian coffee industry, which is a 4 billion Aussie dollar industry per year. And this industry has exploded, but rather than consolidate under a few big companies, it's disintegrated into 6,300 roasteries. And we were talking about that. I was talking to Andrew Tully about that early on, I think. And what we were saying was that I think it has to do that coffee quality, as we as consumers get more discerning, is that time from barrel to cup is critical when you're a discerning coffee drinker. And that connection and community. So, yeah, you know, it was, I don't think that farmers roasting coffee in origin already under finance to farm coffee should be vertically integrated. No.
And sorry, just to follow up on that. Is, for example, from Colombia, Juan Valdez, is that an interesting concept? That within the farmer organization, they also having their own retailer chain? Well, and that's through that capturing most value.
Ask the FNC. They own it. Yeah.
Hi, to follow up on Tim's question, really, but addressed in the perhaps both of you, in terms of governmental organisations and support for farmers, I would imagine in Guatemala an awful lot more active than in Ethiopia, for the better. Perhaps if you could comment on you operating in a different manner to traditional coffee operations in your country, what input, if any, you've had from governmental organisations there, and the rest in Central America.
These one.
I don't think so.
No, so we work with ANACAFE, which is the national organization in Guatemala, and it is funded by all the exports. So we pay a 1% on all exports. That's how it's funded. Apart from giving, it's a support in a technical manner, but we don't have any other relationship with them. Definitely not a trade relationship or anything else. So I don't know if you could elaborate.
Would you want one?
So we and all the producers are capable of receiving, you know, technical advice from them. They have roasting facilities. They have sub offices in every sort of growing region. The technical assistants are supposed to visit your farm twice a year with any suggestions. They do fluid analysis, soil analysis to your farms, anything that you would want from them. You can send your coffee to be cupped at ANACAFE so that you can have a fair judgment of the quality of your coffee, because an exporter might be like, oh, this is terrible quality coffee, we're going to pay very little for it, and then you can dispute that. Apart from that, there's no interference with the government. You do need a license to export through ANACAFE, and that's pretty much the only, they're a facilitator.
So Nadine, in your presentation, you started off by showing us a picture of what most people think of, I suppose, the image of a coffee farmer. And in your presentation, Konrad, you were talking about how you have been working to sort of have an impact on everybody, or whole communities worth of people. So there's obviously quite a lot of almost faceless people in origin and along, you know, throughout the supply chain. When we're talking about sustainability, then how do we, so if you're buying some coffee as a roaster and you're paying more money for a coffee because it's higher quality, and you're kind of making an assumption almost that something is going to happen, something positive is going to happen with that extra money that you're paying. What about the other people in that supply chain? So when we're looking at a sustainable model, then how do we factor in those other individuals people who are working in the dry mill, people who are working in a washing station, people who are picking coffee?
I think sustainability for me is something that no one can actually say they've achieved, because sustainability is it's a constant state. You know, it's not a place you arrive at. You know, it's something that needs to be maintained, and you need to be vigilant to be sustainable. So it depends. You know, every supply chain, every country has its own idiosyncrasies around that. So sustainability for smallholder farmers is often linked to food security. You know, just right at the very beginning, and coffee will be their only form of cash. Employees, which is what you're talking about, you know, people who are employed in the various processes. I think that's where certification can play an important role. What I feel though, as roasters, is that if I sell you coffee, and I think this is part of the result of it being it's still in a state of infancy in our community, is that we talk about it a lot and we tell a lot of stories, but where are the metrics? Like, show me the metrics. So if I sell you a coffee and I claim that it has X, Y, and Z impact, and I'll show you pictures, you need to develop a vocabulary of understanding of what I owe you as your supplier, in the same way a supermarket does. You know, there needs to be provenance of that product, particularly if I'm touting it. It's complicated. Smucker's, this jam company in the US, bought Folgers Millstone from Procter & Gamble, and they have a sustainable program, and it turns out for all of their strawberry jam, I think they had 47 farmers in California. They went to Guatemala and they visited a co-op and had like 80,000 members. So, you know, big difference.
This is a comment more than anything else, but also a question to Konrad. Certainly in Latin America, the structure is different from what you're describing as the African situation. But as you look at the economics, you focused starting basically from the delivery point of the bean to the industrial process, which then goes through the various milling and process to be exported. And as you quite correctly said, that's a relatively short process. That's 1 or 2 months. The other 10 months is really what the producer carries. And if it's a very small producer who has a very small property, they need to live those other 10 months. And the problem of the coffee producer themselves is that the people involved, yes, you may have a large property, as for example the Russians would have. If you have small producers who are much too small to really be able to survive strictly on their coffee production, the coffee cycle itself has several elements to it. One of them is the guy who owns or controls the property and will produce that coffee, but he's going to need, or she is going to need, pickers, which is a seasonal job. They're going to need people to fertilize, which is a seasonal job. So you have a whole number of individuals who can only partially during that year live from that. How do you integrate that into sustainability?
So the smallholder farmers.
Push the red button.
Can you hear me? There you go.
Yeah.
The smallholder farmers that we work with do not employ anybody. There are plots of land, and I'm talking about Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and in the Congo. These farmers are subsistence farmers that multi-crop. So predominantly they produce food. One of the huge problems about scaling coffee is time. People are spending so much time growing food crops that it's not about growing more coffee. They don't have the time in their day. So they tend to be their own labor. A lot of the work that we do in these communities is about community mobilization. What we now have is in some of the container loads of coffee that we ship, we can have up to 3,000 farmers' coffee in that container, just because they're such small producers. So it's this idea of strength in numbers. And that comes easily to these communities because many of them are interdependent anyway. They have so many currencies in their communities. Money is the least available. They barter and trade various other currencies. So for us, it's important because a lot of these farmers will just carry their coffee to market on a Wednesday or Saturday and sell it to a local middleman for a bit of cash to then buy the goods they can't grow. So it's this idea of trying to mobilize people into communities, because if you can provide agronomy training, as we do in Tanzania and Rwanda, this is not just about increasing the coffee yield, it's about increasing their skills to produce more food. It has a far more holistic impact. And you're right, I mean, a lot of the work that we do is around creating access to credit. In West Africa, there's a system, I think it's called the tontine, where if we were all together, we would borrow money together and we would inter-guarantee each other. So if any one of us defaulted, the rest of us would have to cough up and pay. So it becomes sort of self-policing. They're various models. So cooperative culture in Latin America is very strong. It's not in Africa. It leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. There's a lot of nationalization, a lot of theft and robbery.
If I may add to that, and that is an issue, by the way, which is a major issue in Latin America. I mean, I come from a very small country that produces less and less coffee per year, El Salvador, and one of the big issues is the large number of migrant workers that the coffee system requires, which are becoming less and less available for several reasons. Obviously, one of them is that El Salvador has mismanaged its coffee, but that's an aside. But more importantly, because there are competing opportunities. Obviously, the most attractive to people who used to work in the countryside is to jump on the train and go to the United States and work illegally there in construction or whatever. But whatever those are, they effectively are making the possibilities of developing coffee in Central America much more difficult, and I think that Nadine would more than confirm that. In fact, El Salvador and Guatemala compete for the same labor at the same time to do the coffee picking and to do the other migrant labor type of jobs. But it is an issue that needs to be addressed as part of the sustainability. And I find, I mean, your presentation was absolutely fantastic. But I think that the real conclusion of that is that under the present circumstances, the price of coffee is not sustainable if countries like Salvador and Guatemala and Costa Rica are going to try to continue producing, because they're going to have to compete with labor costs that are that have nothing to do with coffee. And somewhere I think that the pricing structure of coffee is going to have to rise to reflect that.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in El Salvador with La Majada and with Beneficio Santa Rosa and on.
I grew up there.
Okay, beautiful part of the world. And I've been working in Nicaragua since 1997. I've been to Guatemala quite often and been to Huehuetenango. And Guatemala interests me because it has a lot of similarities to Africa, certainly South Africa, for various reasons. I think El Salvador is difficult because you have a dollar economy. It's also, so that automatically makes it more tricky. You have climate change, significant climate change in Salvador, and you have an economy that's really diverse. I mean, the services that El Salvador produces are a sophisticated economy. It doesn't feel like an agricultural economy at all. It's a terrible thing to say. I love El Salvadorian coffee, I really do, but I wonder about the long-term future of El Salvador and its ability to produce coffee, other than maybe small islands of really Highland specialty coffee where people receive huge premiums, like Mr. Batros.
You're absolutely right, but I don't think that it's specifically just a Salvadorian problem. Colombia, if you talk to Dr. Orduz of the organization, mentions the same problems. It's becoming an issue, and certainly Guatemala and Mexico have that same problem, as well as, and Costa Rica is way ahead in the game on that score, because they are all much more diversified economies. But there has to be a solution to that, because in first place, the issues in El Salvador today aren't even necessarily the profitability issues. There are regions of El Salvador as well as Guatemala where there's really nothing else that will generate an income and preserve the environment. That's got to be, one of the big issues. Certainly in El Salvador, which is massively deforested, I would say about 80% of the remaining forests in Salvador are actually coffee production, and everything has to be done to preserve that. So there has to be a solution found to be able to continue developing those areas in the only cash crop that will retain those forests.
I have no response.
One question over here.
I don't have a microphone. I shout, perhaps?
Yeah, or you can join us over here if you'd like. There's a.
That's easy.
Hello. Okay. Hi. Yes, Konrad. I like that when you were talking about the ownership of the coffee. It was interesting. I set up an ethical initiative called the Colombian Coffee Company, and we're trying to permit access to smallholders, producers of good coffees, high quality coffees. But there is something that I noticed that is really difficult is I can't see the sustainability because we can't sell it here because we don't sound like a brand. It seems to me that you have to own the coffee with a strong brand name. So what could you advise us in terms of letting access to the small farmers to the coffees here, which is more or less what we're trying to do? For instance, many times I ask in cafes, what variety of coffee is this? The answer I always get is a brand name, no information about the coffee. And we don't look like a big brand. So I do sometimes look suspicious when I'm going to places and say, hi, I'm selling Colombian coffee. It seems weird for people that I'm Colombian and I'm selling Colombian coffee. It's more normal to have a brand name selling Colombian coffee.
We're actually very interested in working in Colombia. I'll give you my card when we're finished, and we could maybe have a conversation specifically about what you're doing, because we could get into quite a long to and fro here.
Falcon Coffees.
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
What would you advise a small holder in Colombia in order to get access to the market in Europe?
Speak to us. It's a really big question. It's about, with smallholder farmers, it's always about leveraging volume. The minimum unit accepted by the commercial roasting industry is 17,500 kilos in a container of Colombian coffee, or 89. Otherwise it's specialty coffee, and then you would have a lot of clients in this room if your coffee was scoring, sort of well above 85 on the SCA cupping score. So it gets subjective. There's a system piece that we can do, and then there's a quality piece, and those need to be looked at separately. It's a vague answer, but it's about the work. Tim is frowning. Here's the solutions.
Yep.
Hello, Konrad. The question of zero cost sustainability isn't the solution to have more investors like yourself who are investing in the local economies of these coffee producing countries, in the sense that coffee, specialty coffee, has a very high transaction utility here in the UK, and as buyers of specialty coffee, we're willing to pay much higher prices compared to Starbucks and so on. Isn't it possible to start more funds like yourself who are then investing that money back into the local economy to encourage economic growth, therefore generate political stability within these poorer nations?
It's a great question, and there is actually a huge amount of activity taking place. It's been one of the positive fallouts of the financial meltdown or the financial crisis from 2008 to date, because Europe and the US have looked like risky investments with low returns. A lot of the developing countries are growing at double digits. People want to invest, but it's a head scratch because it's a very different operating environment. And so we have a plethora of different types of investors that see coffee, because also the derivative side, so it feels sophisticated and you can hedge your risk. They're familiar with those tools. We see a lot of appetite from different sectors for different reasons to invest, and coffee is this incredible vehicle. And there is a huge amount of activity around that. I think sustainability within coffee is still a young industry, and to the remark I made earlier is we need to get more sophisticated about understanding the numbers and the metrics behind, and it's going to happen just naturally as more and more competition comes in to a market like London or the UK, where you have 16-17% growth per annum of the specialty industry. More and more players like us are going to come in. There'll be a natural evolution and price discovery and understanding, which is a good thing.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. So is the future of zero-cost sustainability for specialty coffee more like the entrepreneurial VC environment that we have for tech companies, for example, to encourage startups to have more community-funded wealth funds that are essentially channeling that high-value gap that exists within our economy back into these poorer nations, so that essentially we're promoting stability and sustainability within the producing countries?
Yeah, I mean, what we find typically what investors want are three things. They want capital preservation, they want a return on their investment, and they want social impact. And it's about finding vehicles where you can offer those three things simultaneously. And it's not always easy. And when you look at the returns on coffee and you look at the risk, I have people asking me, what are you doing? It's hugely expensive, it's hugely risky, and the returns are not that great. But I think for me, it's about efficiency. There is so much inefficiency that it's exciting. The efficiency is so radical. I mean, you talk about lending rates by middlemen in a lot of these countries. They can be paying up to 50% interest a month, on the money they're using to buy coffee. So they're penciling that into their price to farmer. If you can get the money at 12%, they would bite your hand off. You offer an investor an opportunity to get a 12% return, and that's they need to get together. Yeah.
There's lots of examples in Bangladesh, for example. I don't know if you've come across the Grameen Bank or microcredit loans and so on. It seems like the industry, from an outsider perspective, and I'm not involved in this industry, but from the outsider perspective, it seems like the capital is locked within the big players and it's not distributed across to. It's almost like you said earlier, the World Bank is kind of like the big players, and actually what you want to have is more smaller lenders who are willing to invest in high risk, because these poorer countries have more motivation to keep up with repayments at a low interest rate, but you have higher repayment rates because you then get your loan back, whereas with the high risk loans, you're at more risk in terms of failure to meet your debt obligations, for example.
People far cleverer than me. I'm wandering into an area that I don't have skills. I think we're actually meeting with the Grameen Foundation in Uganda in September, and what we're talking to them about is tech. There's some amazing mobile phone technology for administering loans, making payments that's very low cost and scalable. You can deploy vast amount of cash to tens of thousands of people swiftly. So yeah.
We're going here, and then we're going there.
Hi. So my question is, how sustainable is it to actually produce good quality coffee in specialty market? We like proudly talking about the fact that we are serving the top 2 to 3% of coffee, world-produced coffee, and we like talking about direct trade, and we don't like fair trade. And then I once had a comment of someone saying that a roaster trading directly might approach a coffee producer, and they will take up 50% of the time. They really needy and demanding, and then they will end up only buying about 10% of their lots of their harvest. So how sustainable is it to produce really high quality coffee?
There are a lot of different variables that play into that. You know, and one of the illustrations I like to give is that sometimes you have smallholder farmers who have 10 coffee trees. So you can pay them triple the world price, and you've just moved their annual income from $60 to $180. They've got 7 children. You know, that's not really moving the needle financially. So sustainability needs to be a lot more holistic. It's not just about paying more. You know, so it's a difficult response. You know, what I think of your industry, that it's vital. I think the third wave movement, which I'm assuming you are part of, the third wave movement for me is kind of the sharp edge of the sustainability wedge, because it is this community that is just raising the bar on how it talks about coffee, how coffee's served, how coffee's roasted, how coffee's prepared, all the activity in social media. You know, I started in coffee. I had to kind of hack my way through a 4-year apprenticeship. And there was all of this ageist environment. I meet people today who have educated themselves on the internet, you know, with incredible passion and desire for knowledge. And so, and that industry is also poorly financed. You know, it's difficult to get the working capital to take stock of really fantastic coffees and then keep them somewhere. So it's equally important for us who maybe have those tools is to deploy them into the other continuation of that supply chain, is into the third wave, and then it becomes community to community, and I think that's when it starts to get interesting. It's a vague answer, but it's the best you can get.
Okay, one last question.
Right, yeah, you guys obviously found great ways that positively impact the people that are growing the coffee. But I own 3 coffee shops in London. What can I do as a shop owner to impact these people? What can I do to make a difference?
I think when you kind of to that last remark, if you are buying high quality coffee, that's a great start, because generally that market segment is the most demanding on information and traceability and provenance. So whoever, if you're not roasting yourself, is, as I should be beholden to my clients to supply that information and provenance, so should you. And that's kind of the beautiful thing for me is that the latent potential of the industry globally is so enormous, but it requires everybody to do their bit. So if we just think about how we behave and what we buy and how we buy it consciously, then that is our role. You know, there is nothing we need to do beyond that. We just need to walk and talk and be and have that awareness, and that's it.
Okay, thank you all very much. There'll be a chance perhaps to chat to Konrad and Nadine, depending on how social they're feeling. At Caffeine, does everyone know where it is? East Castle Street, end of the road, turn right. I'm sure everyone will be walking together. For now, a big hand for Nadine and Konrad.
Could you all drop your glasses onto the bar, please?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming.